Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you believed in, your marriage, your trust, your love, was a lie. Your wife, the woman you've built your life with, has been sneaking behind your back, laughing in the arms of another man. But instead of confronting her, instead of breaking down, you decide to do something else. Something colder. Something permanent. This is the story of a man who didn't just get revenge, he erased himself and destroyed the life of the woman who betrayed him. And the best part? She never saw it coming. Lewis Crawford stood at the kitchen sink, methodically scrubbing dishes, his rough, calloused hands moving in steady, practiced motions. Years of working at a warehouse had ingrained a sense of routine in him. Morning coffee, a long shift, the quiet drive home, dinner with his wife, and sleep. It was predictable, comfortable even. But lately, something felt different, something was off. His wife, Sarah, had changed. At first, he thought little of it. People evolve, after all. A new haircut, a change in clothing style, even the sudden attention to makeup, he found it flattering, refreshing. Maybe she was doing it for him. That thought had warmed him for a while, but soon enough, the warmth turned cold. She had become secretive, slipping away into another room for hushed phone calls, giggling in a way he hadn't heard in years. When he walked into the room, she would quickly hang up or dismiss her call as just a chat with a friend. The problem was, he never caught a name. Her smiles felt different, her touch hesitant. A chasm had begun to grow between them, one neither of them acknowledged but both could feel. One evening, as he was putting away laundry, something unexpected happened. As he reached into the pocket of her coat to straighten it, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. A receipt. Lewis bent down and picked it up, scanning the printed words. $300. Lace lingerie. His stomach twisted. His fingers clenched the paper, eyes fixed on the delicate script of the store's name. He knew all of Sarah's clothes. She wasn't the type to spend money on luxury like this. And if she had, he would have noticed her wearing it. A slow, creeping sense of dread took hold. That night, lying in bed beside her, he found himself staring at the ceiling, sleep an impossible luxury. He remembered the past months, how she'd begun spending more time away from home, how her explanations never quite added up, how she avoided his touch more and more. He wanted to shake the thought from his mind, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already growing. By morning, he had made his decision. Taking a rare day off work, he drove to an electronics store and purchased a small, discreet GPS tracker. It wasn't expensive, and it was simple to install. He told himself it was a precaution, a way to ease his mind. But as he slipped the device under the passenger seat of Sarah's car, a wave of nausea hit him. This wasn't who he was. He was an honest man, a man who trusted his wife. But trust had limits, and his was wearing thin. Days passed. Lewis checked the tracker sparingly, forcing himself to believe there was nothing to find. But then it happened. Lindenwood Inn. A motel on the other side of town. A place that had no reason to be in her usual routine. Yet there it was on the screen. Once. Twice. 3 times. Every visit, over 2 hours long. Lewis sat in his car that night, staring at the glowing dots on his phone screen, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. His mind screamed for an explanation, any explanation, but deep down, he already knew. The truth was sitting right in front of him. She was lying to him. Sarah Crawford was having an affair. That night, Lewis didn't sleep. He lay beside her, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, the weight of betrayal settling deep in his chest. Something inside him hardened, shifted into something cold, something calculating. He wasn't the kind of man who made reckless decisions. He wasn't the type to act out in anger. But he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Lewis Crawford sat in his car, parked across the street from Lindenwood Inn, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The motel wasn't fancy, just a low-rise building with faded signage, the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen. He had spent the last few days tracking Sarah's movements, watching as her car made its way here again and again. Tonight, he needed to see it with his own eyes. A part of him still hoped for some kind of misunderstanding, some innocent explanation that would prove his worst fears wrong. But as he saw her car pull into the lot, his stomach clenched. She parked near the entrance, stepped out, and glanced around as if checking for onlookers. Guilt. That's what it looked like. And then, he arrived. A man Lewis recognized immediately. Daniel Hayes. The smooth-talking real estate agent from Sarah's office. The guy who always seemed a little too charming, a little too familiar whenever Lewis had seen them together at work events. Daniel pulled in 2 spaces away, stepping out with the kind of confidence that set Lewis's teeth on edge. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of effortless charisma that made people trust him. The kind of man who took what he wanted without hesitation. And Sarah? She practically ran to him. Lewis felt his breath catch in his throat as he watched his wife throw her arms around another man, pressing her lips against his like she hadn't just left their shared home that morning, like she hadn't kissed Lewis goodbye on her way out the door. Something inside him shattered. His hand trembled as he reached for his phone, barely able to steady it as he snapped a few photos. Evidence. That's what he needed now, proof. But even as he took the pictures, he felt detached, as if he were watching someone else's life unravel instead of his own. His wife. His Sarah. The woman he had loved for 15 years, the woman he had built a life with, she was standing in a parking lot, wrapped in another man's arms. Daniel whispered something into her ear, making her laugh, before leading her inside. The motel doors shut behind them, sealing Lewis out. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring at that closed door, feeling as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. There was no misunderstanding. No mistake. She had betrayed him. The pain was unbearable, an open wound that throbbed with every breath. But beneath it, something colder was taking shape. A quiet, calculating anger. Lewis wasn't a violent man. He wasn't reckless. But he also wasn't a fool. He had spent his life being steady, reliable, the kind of man who never acted without thinking. That was his strength. And if Sarah thought he would react like a heartbroken fool, if she thought she could keep lying to his face while sneaking off with another man, she had underestimated him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lewis Crawford sat in the dim glow of his basement, staring at the collection of damning evidence displayed across his computer screen. The photos he had taken outside the Lindenwood Inn, Sarah in the arms of another man, were neatly arranged in a folder alongside emails, bank statements, and screenshots of text messages. Each one was another blade to the gut, another undeniable confirmation of what he already knew. His wife had betrayed him, not just physically but in every way that mattered. For days he had watched the blinking dot on the GPS tracker move back and forth, always landing at the same place. At first, he had hoped for some explanation, a business meeting, a coincidence, anything that would give him a reason to doubt his own paranoia. But there were no coincidences. Only lies. He had followed her that night, parked in the shadows, and watched as she melted into the embrace of Daniel Hayes, the real estate agent from her office. Lewis had always had a bad feeling about him. Too charming, too smooth, the kind of man who knew exactly how to take what he wanted. And now, it was confirmed. Daniel had taken his wife. Lewis had never been the type to act out in rage. He was a man of order, of quiet strength. He didn't lash out. He didn't throw fits. No, he planned. And as he sat there, the cool metal of the flash drive between his fingers, he realized something. He wasn't just going to leave. He was going to destroy them both. It started with the security footage. He had visited the Lindenwood Inn, pretending to be an aspiring writer researching small-town scandals. The manager, an older man with a fondness for long-winded stories, was all too eager to share gossip about the guests who thought they were being discreet. With a bit of charm and a well-placed bribe, Lewis found himself in the small back office, scrolling through footage. And there it was. Sarah and Daniel. Entering the motel. again and again. Sometimes nervous, other times so wrapped up in each other that they didn't even look around. Lewis copied the clips onto his drive and left, barely acknowledging the manager's parting words. The evidence was enough to destroy everything. His next stop was their bank accounts. Sarah had always been careless with money, but now her recklessness would cost her. She had been using their joint account for hotel stays, expensive dinners, and even gifts, things Lewis had never received. He systematically drained every shared asset, transferring what was his into an account under a new identity. Then, he closed the accounts entirely, leaving her without access to a single cent. But that was just the beginning. That night, while Sarah was still wrapped up in whatever excuse she had given him for being late, Lewis printed every piece of evidence: emails, receipts, text messages, screenshots of bank transfers. He compiled them into neat, organized packages, each one sealed in a manila envelope. And then he sent them out. One to her company's board members, exposing her improper relationship with a coworker. One to Daniel's wife, complete with photos and financial records. One to Daniel's employer, detailing the ways he had used company resources to cover for his affair. And one, the final and most damning, was left on Sarah's pillow. He imagined the moment she would come home, tired from a night of pretending, only to find the truth waiting for her. A letter, short and simple, resting atop the wreckage of her former life. Sarah, I know everything. The affair. The lies. The motel. The money. Every whispered word, every stolen moment. You thought you were clever, but you were never as careful as you believed. I have taken back what was mine. You don't need to look for me. You don't need to explain. We're done. When she reached for her phone to call him, she would find it disconnected. When she tried to use her credit cards, they would be declined. When she arrived at work the next morning, she would be escorted out. And when she ran to Daniel for comfort, she would find his world crumbling alongside hers. Lewis didn't wait to watch it happen. He had no interest in seeing her beg or plead or justify the unjustifiable. By the time she returned home, he was already gone, miles away, a man without a past, a man without a name. He had spent years being the quiet, reliable husband, the man who never raised his voice, who never caused trouble. But in the end, Sarah had forced his hand. She had taken everything from him, his trust, his love, his life. So he had done the same. And as he drove through the darkened streets, the city shrinking behind him, he felt nothing. Not guilt. Not regret. Not even relief. Only the cold, unshakable certainty that he had won. The town was waking up to the aftermath of Lewis Crawford's departure, but he was already gone, a ghost in the life he once knew. The man who had lived at 421 Oak Ridge Drive no longer existed. His name had been erased from bank accounts, his job resigned from with a curt email, his presence reduced to an empty shell of a house littered with shattered picture frames and a final letter of farewell. Somewhere, Sarah Crawford was waking up to the wreckage. He imagined the moment she realized everything was gone, the bank accounts emptied, the credit cards declined, the job lost, the affair exposed. It wasn't just about taking revenge. It was about ensuring that she felt the weight of every betrayal, every deception, every choice she had made. She had built her new life on lies, and now it was crumbling beneath her. He could see it so clearly. Sarah walking into work, head held high, only to be pulled aside by HR. Her confusion, her mounting panic as she was handed a folder, his folder, filled with copies of her secret emails, her fraudulent expense reports, her inappropriate use of company funds. The way her face would pale as she was escorted out of the building, her career reduced to ash in a single morning. Then there was Daniel Hayes. Lewis had made sure that his wife received a package too. Every message, every motel receipt, every picture of him and Sarah entangled in their sordid affair. There was no dramatic confrontation, no screaming match, just the dull, numbing realization as Faith Hayes changed the locks on their home and left divorce papers on the porch. Sarah and Daniel had built their affair on stolen time, whispers in the dark, secret rendezvous behind closed doors. But now everything was out in the open, laid bare for the world to see. And Lewis? He was miles away, watching it all burn from a distance. The first news article appeared a week later. Scandal at Oak Ridge Realty. CEO Daniel Hayes resigns amidst controversy. Lewis read it over breakfast in a small roadside diner, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through the article. Daniel had tried to fight it, of course, but once the affair became public knowledge, once clients started pulling their business, once Faith filed for divorce, once the lawsuits started stacking up, he had no choice but to walk away. And Sarah? She was jobless, broke, and alone. She had tried to reach out, calls, emails, even showing up at his former job, begging for answers. But Lewis had made sure there was nothing left to find. The only trace of him that remained was his final letter and the cold, empty silence that followed. Still, he kept watching, curious how far she would fall. 2 weeks later, Sarah's car was repossessed. Lewis watched the grainy traffic cam footage of her standing outside her apartment, arguing with the repo man as he hooked her sedan up to the tow truck. She had no way of knowing he was watching. He had tapped into security feeds, local news, even created fake social media accounts to monitor the slow, steady collapse of her life. It was fascinating in a way. The woman who had once laughed behind his back, who had spent their shared money on hotels and jewelry for another man, was now barely scraping by. She had moved out of their old house. It had been his, after all, purchased long before they met. She was living in a rundown apartment now, surviving off what little savings she had left. But Lewis wasn't done yet. He still had one more move to make. The email to Sarah's parents was short and to the point. Subject: you should know. I don't expect you to believe me, but I thought you should see the truth. Attached, you'll find the evidence. Everything your daughter has done. Every lie. Every betrayal. Consider this my last message. L. He attached the files and hit send. Within a day, her parents had disowned her. Within a week, she had nowhere left to turn. And as Lewis sat in his rented apartment, watching the final pieces of his plan fall into place, he realized something. He thought he would feel satisfaction. He thought he would feel triumphant. He thought it would feel like winning. But instead, there was only emptiness. Sarah was broken. She had lost everything. She had nothing left. And for the first time, Lewis wondered if he had gone too far. That night, as Sarah sat alone in her empty apartment, staring at the cease and desist order from Lewis's lawyer, the final nail in the coffin, ensuring she would never contact him again, he made a decision. It was time to stop watching. It was time to let go. He powered down his laptop, turned off the monitors, and poured himself a glass of whiskey. The past was over. He had destroyed her, dismantled everything she had built, burned their life together to the ground. Now, it was time to move forward. To disappear for good. To start a new life. And for the first time in months, he felt at peace. Lewis Crawford no longer existed. The man who had spent years being the quiet, dependable husband, the man who had been betrayed and humiliated, was gone. In his place was Nick Bennett, a man with no past, no ties, no regrets. He had spent the past few months carefully constructing his new identity, new bank accounts, a new apartment, a new job as a freelance consultant that allowed him to work from anywhere. He had chosen a quiet coastal town, far enough from his old life that no one would recognize him, but not so remote that he would feel completely alone. It was a strange feeling, starting over at his age. He had spent 15 years building a life with Sarah, and now, at 42, he was living in a place where no one knew his name. There were no whispers of betrayal, no memories haunting the corners of his home. Just the rhythmic crash of the ocean against the shore and the quiet hum of a world that had moved on without him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt free. The book deal came sooner than expected. It had started as a way to process everything, writing down his thoughts, his emotions, the raw betrayal he had endured. But as the pages filled, the story took on a life of its own. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about transformation, about what happens when a man who has spent his whole life playing by the rules decides to rewrite them. Under the name M.B. Fowler, he published his first novel, The Postman Always Knows. It was an instant sensation. Readers devoured it, drawn in by the gripping tale of a man who discovers his wife's affair and meticulously dismantles her life before vanishing without a trace. Critics praised its cold precision, the psychological depth, the quiet power of its protagonist. What they didn't know was that every word was real. The book climbed the bestseller lists, interviews flooded in, movie studios made offers. And all the while, Lewis watched from the shadows, amused by the irony of it all. The world sympathized with the wronged husband, celebrated his intelligence, dissected his choices in book clubs and online forums. Sarah, wherever she was, must have realized the truth. But she couldn't prove it. Not without exposing herself. And that was the final stroke of genius. Even if she screamed the truth from the rooftops, no one would believe her. One afternoon, in a small bookstore, he saw her. Sarah Crawford, if that was still her name, stood in the aisle, staring at a stack of books, his books. She looked different. Thinner. Older. Defeated. She picked up a copy, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Maybe she was searching for herself in the words. Maybe she wanted to know how much he had told the world. Maybe she was hoping to understand how he had outplayed her so completely. For a moment, Lewis considered approaching her. He could imagine it so clearly, the way her breath would catch, the way her eyes would widen in realization. He could offer kind words, a polite smile, pretend to be a stranger. But he didn't. Instead, he simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, alone with the weight of what she had lost. Because in the end, she was just another reader now. He adopted a dog that same week. A stray from the local shelter, a mutt with tired brown eyes and a cautious demeanor. The volunteers had named him Max, abandoned by his previous owners, wary of trust but desperate for companionship. Lewis saw too much of himself in the animal to walk away. "You and me both," he murmured, scratching behind Max's ears as they walked along the shore later that evening. Two survivors. Two ghosts of their former lives. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging slightly, and for the first time in months, Lewis felt something unfamiliar. Not revenge. Not triumph. Not emptiness. Something softer. Something like peace. The story of Lewis Crawford was over. His past no longer defined him. His revenge was complete. His future was unwritten. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he let the waves carry away the last echoes of the man he used to be. It was time to start living again.